There's a particular little expression on Mr. Hofmann's face here that I particularly remember. It's a little curve around his mouth. And his absolute attention to the keyboard. He was quite a wonderful person when it came to thinking about piano. I'm sure he thought about piano in ways that ordinary people don't. He was the first person I knew who had a concept of how a composition should sound. It took me years and years and years before I even knew what the term concept could mean, much less form my own concepts of what a composition should sound like. But he had, from the word go, he knew how a composition should sound. And all he had to do was make it sound that way. It was that simple for him. To this day, when I form a concept about a composition, it changes 1,000 times. And I work and work and work to produce, only to say, that's not exactly what I wanted at all, not even close. And I keep striving and working and pulling and pushing. I don't think he went through that process. He could hear a concerto whole. And I think that's the difference between a really great artist and somebody like me. You want to know about Mr. Hofmann, and I'll tell you how I first met him. I had, at that time, the most prominent teacher of piano in the area. This was Berkeley, California, and her name was Alma Schmidt-Kennedy, and she was reputedly a student of Leschetizky, hence the great background. And I am willing to believe it because she gave me a very good start in scales and in arpeggios and also in harmony. She taught me the names of the chords, and she was a very patient lady and a very nice lady. And she wanted very much to get me under the tutorship of a world-class person. She was modest, and she eventually wanted for me to go to Europe. But whenever a celebrity came to town, she made sure that I played for that celebrity. And the first of those celebrities was Josef Hofmann. And first, I was taken to a concert that he performed. And he performed on his program the B-flat minor Chopin Sonata. And I still can hear in my mind how that sonata sounded. It was so fascinating to me. I had never heard any kind of a funeral march before. And this, the somberness of it, and the middle of it that had that delicate legato sound, something quite arresting. And this stayed in my mind. I always wanted to play it like that. When I play it today, I try to play it like my remembrance of that. So he made a very, very strong impression on me. The idea of meeting him was hers entirely, Mrs. Kennedy's. And she arranged that he listened to one of my programs. At that time, I was 4 years old. I played in Mills College, and it was a real, genuine program, and not by any means my first. I had played a couple of little programs before that in other halls, but this Mills College program was my first professional concert because people bought tickets to hear me. I didn't know the difference at that time, but now I am aware of that. In fact, on the back of my program, they feature an ad for Steinway pianos, and it says, "Baby Ruth has wisely chosen the Steinway as her instrument," which I thought was kind of amazing because I would play naturally on any piano that was put in front of me. So I was kind of lucky to have a good Steinway to play on for that first. I was overawed by the size of the instrument, of course, because I had never played on a real genuine concert grand before, always on uprights or on smaller grands, but never a 9-foot concert grand. But it was an interesting experience because the bass was so strong, and yet when I played a chromatic scale all the way from the bottom to the top of the keyboard, I noticed that it was all in proportion and even, and I was thoroughly entranced with experimenting with this. And I was told, I suppose, that Mr. Hofmann would be in my audience, but it didn't make too much impression on me because of the piano itself. The piano itself was so fascinating to me that was my first thought upon walking on stage, was not there's this important, wonderful pianist in the audience. I completely forgot that. I completely forgot the audience. What I did remember was the evenness of this sound all the way from the bottom to the top. So I was more concerned with where I went to take my bow before I played my program than the program itself, which I figured I did every single day and I practiced on, and so I knew that was going to be all right. So as far as nerves are concerned, a little kid doesn't know what that means. But in any case, the concert went by, and I do remember that afterward, I was told Mr. Hofmann was there, and by golly, I met him. And it was quite fascinating to me. I liked him right away. You know, he was a father figure, and he was the person that I recognized from having played this magnificent funeral march that I remember. I also remember the movement after the funeral march that's called Wind Over the Graves, and he made it sound eerie. I could hear the wind going through trees. It was quite a wonderful sound, And this made a huge impression on me. And then I visited him in his hotel room, and he wanted to see if I really knew harmony, as Mrs. Kennedy said I did, and he asked me to play various chords for him and various scales for him, which I did. And apparently he was satisfied because he invited my father and me to come to Curtis Institute in Philadelphia. And of course, this was Mrs. Kennedy's dream. She thought that this would be the most marvelous place for me to go and study. Now, remember, I was barely 5 years old at that time. I had played my recital when I was 4, and it took several months before the negotiations for me to go there were made. Apparently, an apartment was rented for us to occupy, and there was a grand piano in it, and my father believed in 9 hours a day of practice. Even then, he got me up at 6 and made me practice, and apparently the neighbors complained. And at one point, Mrs. Hofmann said to my father, "You shouldn't do this. The neighbors are complaining because of all the practice." And my father said, "Well, I like cars. And if you have a Ford automobile, it doesn't take such a big engine. It doesn't take much gas. But if you have a larger car, it takes a larger engine and it takes a great deal more gas. And my daughter is a Cadillac, so it takes a lot of work." And Mrs. Hofmann came with the premise, maybe if she has to practice so hard, she isn't the great genius that you say she is. And of course, he tossed that idea out immediately. Didn't even think about it twice or once. But in any case, I went to Mr. Hofmann's house for a lesson, and he was in this role quite marvelous. I remember he asked me to play scales, but he asked me one hand alone and the other hand alone. And I was so proud of being able to play both hands together. And he would say, "Your left hand is poor. Your left hand is not nearly as good as your right hand." He said, "Your left hand is a passenger. Your right hand is playing and the left hand is hanging on. It isn't playing on its own." And I realized this when he made me do scales with the left hand alone. And he was quite insistent on my hand was too weak. Well, it was. I was 5 years old, so of course I didn't have a very strong hand. And he wanted there to be a roof, as he said, when your hand is on the piano. The knuckles should form like a roof over your hand. It shouldn't be down low. So, in any case, he had to see me do scales in the way that he liked scales to be done. And he wanted his scales to start softly and to make an uninterrupted crescendo all the way to the top, and an uninterrupted decrescendo all the way to the bottom. And this was exceedingly difficult for me to do, because no matter how I tried, there would be a little accent here, a little accent there. I can hear wherever you play the thumb, he would say, or wherever you play the third finger. You don't have control over your hand, particularly the left hand. And so all this negative stuff didn't make too much impression on me. But what did make an impression on me, and what was the real reason I went for my lessons, was the fact he had a little boy for me to play with. And his little boy was Anton, and he was just as nice a little playmate as you could possibly ask for. He was my playmate after each lesson. And I let my father talk to Mr. Hofmann. Well, I think they spoke Polish a little bit, but in any case, my father and Mr. Hofmann would talk, and I could play in the back outside the studio in a kind of garden with Anton. And we didn't play, tag or anything like that, although we did a little bit. And we'd get kind of noisy, and my father or Mr. Hofmann would keep us quiet. Well, from his pocket, we played with these little things that I was just told are called jacks, and a little rubber ball. And we'd not make any noise, but we could play and we could fuss with them, and we could laugh kind of quietly, and it was fun. And then at some point, Mrs. Hofmann would come out, and she was the most beautiful lady, I thought. And she'd have us both in for a cookie and a glass of milk. And she was just as sweet as she could be. And I remember when I was married, I had a beautiful marriage for 34 years to a wonderful man. When I was married, I wanted all times to be the kind of wife that I thought Mrs. Hofmann was, because she always looked at her husband. She was hoping to please him in every possible way that she could. And that's the way I felt about my husband. I always wanted to please him as much as I could. Well, at one point, Mr. Hofmann had to go away and play concerts. And so when he went away, then I couldn't take lessons from him. And so he recommended that I go to the Curtis Institute and take lessons from a lady called Isabelle Vengerova. And I had only heard about her from the other students, kind of rumors. People were afraid of this woman. Well, she immediately put me into a technique class. And other members of the class, who were just piano students, as I was, were people who eventually became quite famous. There was George Bolet, and there was Shura Cherkassky, and it was A.B. Simon. But the boys were all much better than I was, with the exception of one. This boy we called the pen pusher, because he was a composition student and also a voice major who took piano technique only incidentally to back up his other studies. And his name was Samuel Barber, a wonderful boy. We all knew that he was so special. He was more than the rest of us combined. We felt it, we knew it, but he couldn't perform on the piano. He was inept. But of course, if somebody else had been inept, we would have been eager to show our prowess, how much better we could do. But never with Sam, somehow. We thought that, let him be inept. He's got something more than we have. He has more than we can do. We can't compose original music. This boy can. Now, of course, he was a great big boy. I was little tiny. But when you're little tiny like me and you play the piano, you think that you're a pianist. All these other kids were pianists, regardless of their size, of their age. And of course, the others, and even Sam Barber, we remained friends for as long as we lived. We were on this earth. Shura Cherkassky, when I met him on tour, why, he was somebody that we threw our arms around each other immediately. We were chums, we were friends. We whispered all kinds of little secrets together. We were kids together. And of course, George Bolet would call up. He'd find out from the manager what hotel I was staying at and say, I'm in town, let's have fun. Or anybody. And the kids that you meet in class like that, there is no substitute for the kind of friendships you make in a class such as Madame Vengerova's. And we all had various thoughts about Madame Vengerova and what she made us do with our technique. It's odd how we all turned into individual personalities and pianists under a really, really fine teacher who knows how to give you the background, the foundation, so that you can build on it. We all wound up with a certain amount of technique so that we could handle the piano pretty well. And the stories that I can tell you about Samuel Barber are particularly wonderful, because everybody in the school knew that he was a little bit more than just the average good music student. He was a person who was under the tutelage of Fritz Reiner, and people shrank when they thought they were going to have to play in front of Fritz Reiner. Fritz Reiner was our orchestra conductor. And he could slash you to little bits, tongue lashing. He was really terrible. And this poor kid was under his special tutelage. We all felt sorry for him. It was just terrible. Well, one day, Fritz Reiner gave an assignment to all the kids whom he taught to write a string quartet. And of course, Sam Barber wrote a string quartet. And he naturally played little bits of it for us in class, this theme from the first movement, the second theme from the first movement. And we were in awe because none of us had the imagination to write like this. Oh, Sam Barber was special. And then when he finally presented it in class to Mr. Reiner, we all, what did he say? What did he say? What did he say? And Mr. Reiner said, oh, you can throw it all out with the exception of the second movement, but that has possibilities. He said, why don't you enlarge this? And why don't you try to orchestrate this? It really is more than a string quartet should do. Orchestrate it. Bring in a few more instruments. Make it bigger. And of course, this to Sam Barber was, I've succeeded. I can do this. And so he worked on it and worked on it, and he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And he wrote all the instruments down that he wanted in it. And it was considered by Mr. Reiner good enough to play at the school concert. And this was a great big triumph for Sam. And we all thought he was a genius of some kind. Why don't you send it out to orchestra conductors, to orchestras all over? And, you know, in those days, there was nobody that you could get to write music for you. You had to do it yourself, painstakingly by hand on music paper. And he would stay up all night long just writing parts for this second movement that he had enlarged. And then he had a complete set, and he sent this off. He was told he should start at the top, and he certainly did. He sent it to Arturo Toscanini, who at that time was conducting the NBC Symphony, the most revered orchestra in the country. And of course, did you hear from him? Did you hear from him? Every week, every month. No. Well, at one point, he wrote to Toscanini and said, obviously you're not interested in my composition, and since it is so difficult and costly to hire somebody to write out parts, please send them back to me. And he got an immediate answer. How can I send you back your score? I'm going to program it in December. And, the whole school was in an uproar. We were all in an uproar. This was the Adagio for strings. And to have been present there at the beginning, I think, was one of the most exciting things in my whole life. Well, anyway, Mr. Hofmann did come back from his tour, and I was in the class of Madame Vengerova, and he was satisfied that my scales were somewhat better, but he thought at that time that maybe it would be nice for Curtis Institute to tell the world that they had a talented child so that more people would hear more about Curtis. And I think that they took films of me walking out on the stage in the hall of Curtis Institute there and showing me sitting down and playing. And my father, who always had a feeling about being taken advantage of, didn't like this. He felt that I was being exploited by Curtis so that Curtis would get the fame and fortune of producing a genius such as his daughter. And he felt that this should not happen. And he was very angry at all of this. And the next thing I know, I was taken out of there, and we went back to California. So that was the end of my visits with Tone and my visits with Mr. Hofmann and his dear wife. But they left a memory, a wonderful memory, and of course all the friends that I made. And I can never hope to be present at the birth of a masterpiece as I was then when I was 5 years old at Curtis. When I was 9, 10 years old, I had the privilege of having 9 lessons under Sergei Rachmaninov. And of course, Mr. Rachmaninov was a great believer in hard work, always telling me I didn't work hard enough, and that was as if anybody could tell my father that I needed to work harder. He had me up by 6 a.m. and had me working all day, had me working in order to earn my breakfast, and then in order to earn my lunch, and then in order to earn my supper at night, in order to earn my walk, in order to earn the privilege of going to sleep at night. Oh, it was forever, always working. And Mr. Rachmaninov said about this 9 hours a day, why, that's nothing. He said at one point, I worked 17 hours a day. And I said, well, what made you work so hard? He said he wanted to have a technique that would approach that of Josef Hofmann. And that's how great Josef Hofmann was revered by one of the titans of the keyboard. Not only that, but by a creative artist, not just a recreative artist such as me. So it gave me a lot of respect for the work of Josef Hofmann. Not only was Rachmaninoff feeling like that, but almost any pianist thought that the titans of the past were far greater than any of the people that were really playing quite a bit in my era of growing up. Josef Hofmann was singular. That's quite something to be able to say, I knew him. I heard him. And I played with his little boy, Tone. I did.